Welcome to the Leesburg Public Library virtually. Today's Florida History Lecture is presented by Dr. David Head. And David Head is a historian, author, and associate lecturer of history at the University of Central Florida. David grew up in Western New York, where he received his BA in history from Niagara University and his PhD from the University at Buffalo. An expert on pirates and privateers, as well as on George Washington and the American Revolution, he is the author most recently of A Crisis of Peace, George Washington, the Newburgh Conspiracy, and the Fate of the American Revolution. In addition to his scholarly publications, David's work has appeared in USA Today, the Orlando Sentinel, the Washington Examiner, and the Bulwark. Welcome, David.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon. And I'm delighted to be here speaking to you today about a side of the American Revolution that we often don't get to see, the American Revolution in Florida. We often think of the American Revolution as something that happened in Boston, certainly in Philadelphia, Virginia, but not down here in Florida, especially not Central Florida, which we take to really have a history that goes back to 1971 when Walt Disney World opened. But of course, Florida's history goes way back beyond that. And that's one of the things I'd like to talk to you about today. So I'm going to talk about the Siege of Pensacola, and more broadly, the Gulf Coast Campaign and the American Revolution. Okay. Just to give you an overview of what to expect as I talk. I'm going to talk about the American Revolution's Gulf Coast Theater, and that's taking place in East and West Florida. I'll say a little bit about what East and West Florida were as British colonies, and then I'll talk a little bit about Spain's involvement in the American Revolution, because the Gulf Coast Theater is really Spain's effort to fight the British here. Not so much the Continental Army or the American side per se, but Spain as not an ally of the United States, but certainly fighting against Britain, a co-belligerent, I think is the technical term for what Spain was. I'll talk a little bit about Spain's involvement in the American Revolution and their interest in Florida. Then I'll shift gears to talk about the Gulf Coast Campaign more broadly, and the first couple stages of that campaign by the Spanish against the British. An attack on Baton Rouge in today's Louisiana, and then another attack on Mobile, which is in today's Alabama. Those kind of opening stages of Spain's campaign. And then I'll talk in greater depth about the siege of Pensacola itself. Okay. The main character here that I'll talk a lot about is the man here in the statue, Bernardo de Galvez. And he was the governor of Spanish Louisiana, whose capital at the time was in New Orleans. This is a statue that's been erected of Galvez in Pensacola itself. It's fairly new. I think it was put up in 2018. I used to live in Alabama, outside of Mobile, where I taught at a school in Mobile. And we used to visit Pensacola fairly often to go to the beach. And that statue wasn't there when we lived there. So we have something to go back for. And if you ever go to Pensacola again, you should check that out. It looks quite impressive there. Finally, I'll then finish up by saying a few things about the larger significance of the American Revolution in Florida and the Gulf Coast Campaign. And so that's what the plan for today is. So first, Spain, Britain, and Florida. This is an image here, a map from the 18th century of British Florida. Britain had taken over Florida from Spain at the conclusion of the 7 Years' War. Okay. 7 Years' War is sometimes known in North America as the French and Indian War. That's the North American theater of the 7 Years' War, is the French and Indian War. And the 7 Years' War was a global conflict. So it was all fought in Europe, it's fought in the Caribbean, some fighting in the Indian Ocean and Africa. Okay, in the Philippines, there are some battles, so everywhere. But one of its effects in North America was that Britain took over Florida from Spain. The British then organized the British then organized Florida as two separate colonies. East Florida, which is the bulk of today's state. So Orlando is in East Florida, Leesburg is in what used to be East Florida. The capital of East Florida was at St. Augustine. The other colony that Britain established was West Florida. And West Florida is most of today's panhandle, but more than today's panhandle of Florida. West Florida extended all the way west to the Mississippi River in Louisiana, which means it included not only today's Florida panhandle, but also the bottom parts of Alabama and Mississippi, and then a portion of today's state of Louisiana that's between today's border of Mississippi and state of Mississippi and the Mississippi River. So that portion was part of British West Florida. The capital of West Florida was Pensacola. So that was the major city in West Florida. The dividing line between the two is the Apalachicola River. So it is, this is here. So this is the dividing line between East and West Florida. This is outside of Tallahassee. I think this is Panama City Beach. That area there, I think, is down here. So that's where the border between East and West Florida was. You can still, there's still some significance to this today. This is where the division between the Eastern time zone and the Central time zone is in Florida today. So if you're driving on I-10, right, this long, boring stretch of I-10 from Jacksonville out to Pensacola, if you've ever done that, you switch over the time zones there. Next time, you can impress your travel buddies there by pointing out that, oh, this used to be the border between East and West Florida. And that will relieve the boredom for, 30 seconds. So yeah, so it's worthwhile. So that's East and West Florida in the British period. Who lived in West Florida under the British period? So the colony of British West Florida has a population of about 4,900 people in 1774. And that includes 3,700 free inhabitants and 1,200 enslaved people. And probably there are about maybe 10 times as many natives who live in West Florida. So that's where the bulk of the population is, the native population. That's kind of just an estimate of what the population would be. This is a scene from an 18th century print here of a scene of the Pensacola, the harbor there. So kind of a bustling seaport for the relatively small population in that area. A very important point to understanding West Florida and how it relates to the American Revolution is that West Florida is much, much smaller than Britain's other colonies in North America. So the largest of Britain's colonies in North America is Virginia, and that has a population of about 500,000 people. That's the biggest. The smallest of the original 13 colonies is Georgia. But look at Georgia with 40,000. That's much more, and that's a lot more than the 4,900 of even free and enslaved. So 40,000, free and enslaved people here in Georgia is still, just enormously higher than West Florida's population. And that's the next one up, right? So this is the smallest of the original 13, and West Florida is much, much smaller than that. So that'll influence a lot of what happens in West Florida. West Florida and East Florida, they stay loyal to King George III when the American Revolution breaks out. When the original 13 colonies, they start meeting in Philadelphia, because they don't know they're going to be only the original 13 at that point. Those leaders from New York and Philadelphia and Boston and Virginia and those places, they invite Britain's other colonies to join them in resisting Britain's policies. So that includes East and West Florida. So the Continental Congress meeting in Philadelphia, they write to some of the leaders in West Florida, East Florida, invite them to send a delegation to join the resistance to Britain. And East and West Florida, they refuse. So they stay loyal to the king. Just as the colonies in today's Canada stay loyal to the king, colonies in the Caribbean stay loyal to the king. Okay, so Britain had a lot of colonies, but only those 13 that we know of as the original 13 rebel against Britain. So why did West Florida stay loyal to the king? A number of reasons come together. One of the most important reasons is that West Florida, people who live in West Florida, they experience many of the same events that drive other colonists crazy and drive them to rebel, but they have different effects. They just don't affect them the same way that they affect people living in these other colonies. And that then leads them to pursue different policies, they have a different opinion on the value of the British Empire. So a good example of how these things are just different in West Florida is the Proclamation of 1763. So the Proclamation of 1763 was issued by the king. You'll never guess what year. It was issued at the end of the French and Indian War. And the goal was to keep kind of the Anglo-American colonists separated from Native Americans. So it established this kind of line here between the two groups, so that colonists were supposed to stay on this side of the line, and this side of the line over here was reserved for Native Americans. And the British wanted to do this because the colonists, they are always on the move, and they're trying to push westward, always seeking out new lands to settle on. And when they come in contact with natives, then there's conflict. And when there's conflict, then the British government has to do something about it. And they have to do something to keep the peace. And one of the things that the British officials really don't want to do is to have to do something. They would rather just keep the two sides separate, avoid having to get involved. You know, you stay on your side, you stay on your side, leave each other alone. Don't bother us about this. I always point out to students this, this line doesn't exist like out there in reality. So it's kind of more of a notional kind of line. It's supposed to be the Appalachian Mountains here. Okay, that's really what it's following. Well, look where this line ends. It comes down here to the border of Florida. So that restriction on movement westward does not include West Florida. So people in Pennsylvania, for example, are really angry. They want to be able to move into this area, to move into Ohio lands and all that, but they're not allowed to by the British. Well, if you're here in East Florida, you can move into West Florida all you want. There's no restriction on your movement. And that was a very common settlement pattern, was to land here in St. Augustine and then move across East Florida and then settle over here in West Florida. And that is completely open. So when people in Pennsylvania and Virginia are angry, saying, how could the king restrict our movements? People in the Floridas are like, doesn't affect us. So that's an important thing to keep in mind, that these events that brought other colonies into resistance just didn't affect people in the Florida the same way. Some other reasons here include things like just the obvious distance from the other colonies. They're just a lot further away in an era where transportation and communication are very difficult, especially overland. Things take forever. One thing I realized, I hadn't really appreciated this before, but when I was doing research for my book, I realized that the Continental Congress seldom had representation from Georgia. So they're supposed to have representatives from every colony, but usually they only have 12 at the most states represented, because Georgia just doesn't send representatives. And why do they send representatives? Well, it's the furthest one away. It's also the smallest of those original 13 colonies. Okay? So you put those two factors together and they're just not represented the way the other states are. You can imagine then how much more difficult it would be for West Florida, where you have to sail all the way around Florida and get up there. Just the distance was prohibitive. Another very important factor for people in West Florida when they're considering what to do about all these events, the resistance to the king that's arising in the 1760s and 1770s. People who live in West Florida, they know that they need Britain. They know they need Britain to protect them, because they realize that their population is so small, they cannot protect themselves. They're surrounded by Native Americans who might be hostile to them, but for British efforts at diplomacy to keep those natives on the British side. People in West Florida know that they border Spain, so they're vulnerable to a Spanish invasion. So they know they have enemies, that they're surrounded, and they need Britain's protection. In that sense, then, even if taxes were raised, that's still a good deal for people who live in West Florida. And the calculation is just different than people who live in Massachusetts. People live in Massachusetts, they think they can do without Britain. and their costs are going up, these taxes, and they don't want to pay them, they start to think, why do we need Britain to tax us heavily when we could govern ourselves? We sent our men, our militia, to fight in the French and Indian War. That's the thinking people in Massachusetts. They even go so far as to say, we really won this war here in North America. The British didn't do anything. I mean, they did, but that's not how people start talking. Like, what do we need their protection for? We can do things ourselves. Well, in West Florida, they don't think that way because they know they're dependent on Britain. The smaller factor here that I think is interesting is that there's no newspaper in West Florida. The same way there are newspapers, multiple newspapers in Boston and New York and in Philadelphia and some of the other colonies. Many of those newspapers printing information they received from other places around the empire and always riling up resistance. That simply just didn't exist in West Florida. There's also the kind of calculation of people living in West Florida. They look at this war, if there's a war going to be coming, and they think the Patriots will lose. And at pretty much any point during the American Revolution, that was the way you would probably bet, is that the Patriots are going to lose this war. Even very late in the war, it still looked like the Patriots are going to lose. So why would you join the losing side? Further, people living in West Florida, they can kind of see, even if the Patriots do win, they're probably going to give that land, Florida, back to Spain as a kind of reward for Spain's assistance to the United States. So even if they join the Patriots win, right? Hooray! They're going to give your land away back to Spain. And then what's going to happen to the titles to all that land? Is it going to go back to the original Spanish landholders? And that's all just going to be a big mess. And you can imagine, if anything put your title to your home in danger, you would be very upset about that. So that's kind of the thinking there. Let's say a few things about Spain in the American Revolution, then I'll get to the campaigning itself. We'll get the fullest context we can so it makes sense of the smaller events, particular events. So Spain joined the American Revolution in 1779. Spain was an ally of France and an enemy of Britain, but they were never formally a United States ally. There were negotiations underway between the diplomats representing the two countries to establish a formal alliance, but the war ended before that agreement could be finalized. Okay. So Spain is a formal ally of France, which is an ally of the United States, and a longtime enemy of Britain. So what is, I don't know if that makes it, what is it? The enemy of your enemy is your friend, right? And the friend of your friend is also your friend, I guess. It's been a long time since I took logic, but that's the kind of the sense. They had the common enemy and a common friend, so they are loosely associated on the same side. Spain's goals for joining the American Revolution, well, number one, take the British down a peg. That's always a good thing for them. But more specifically than that is that they would like to regain some lost territory lost to the British during previous wars in the 18th century. Two primary locations they really want back are Gibraltar, which is still owned by Britain today, been taken by Britain in one of the earlier wars in the 18th century, which is attached to Spain itself. This will kind of carve out for England there. It was a strategic naval base at the entrance to the Mediterranean from the Atlantic. And then also the island of Minorca, which again is just a tiny little island. Wouldn't think it has any significance except its position in the Mediterranean and its ability, its usefulness for sort of naval operations in the Mediterranean. Sometimes I give this talk in the past. I've asked people if they've ever been. Some people have been to Minorca. It's like a place where you stop on a Mediterranean cruise. It's supposed to be tiny but beautiful, and so you get some sense of its importance given its location in the Mediterranean. Another goal is that Spain would also like to protect its access to the Gulf of Mexico, also its colonies in Spanish Louisiana and in New Spain, right, Mexico. So having the British part here stick out is kind of a problem. Okay? So they'd like to have that unfettered access into this area here. So those are their interests. Now you notice here what's missing is any kind of sympathy for the American cause or the cause of independence. And that's noteworthy, but also very understandable because Spain is a monarchy. They don't really want these ideas of anti-monarchy, Republican kind of thinking getting too far, because they have colonies of their own. And actually, the Spanish colonies will have their own rebellion in the future. But it's these kind of specific territorial goals they're interested in, and also diminishing Britain, not supporting the cause of independence. And now to get to talking about Spain's Gulf Coast campaign and some of the first moves that were undertaken. Now we kind of understand what Spain's interest in this territory is and why they're fighting in the American Revolution. I mentioned in passing a few minutes ago that the effort is really led by Governor Bernardo de Galvez, and he's the governor of Louisiana, centered in New Orleans. His strategy is to assemble a force from anybody willing to take up arms. So he kind of cobbles together this force from many different sources. He puts together the regular members of the regular Spanish army. So these are full-time soldiers sent from Spain who are on duty in New Orleans. One of the regiments of that force is really interesting. They're the so-called Hibernia Regiment. These were Irishmen who enlisted to serve in the Spanish army, to get some idea of how diverse the force was. There's also local militia. So militia being soldiers who are not professional soldiers, but who serve in the military temporarily as needed. Then there are free Black Louisianans, then also a number of Afro-Cubans, so people of African descent who had been brought to Cuba, enslaved there, they gained their freedom, and then had migrated to Louisiana. A number of natives of various tribes. Acadians, ask yourself, do you know who the Acadians are? The Acadians are actually French, and they were driven out of Canada during the during the 7 Years' War. They resettled in Louisiana, and those are today's Cajuns. So the Cajuns were originally the French Canadians relocated to Louisiana. And then a handful of Americans, right? People, it's hard to say Americans in this period, but people of Anglo descent who had grown up in one of the American colonies and then ended up in Louisiana. Galvez's strategy is to take the British posts in the area piece by piece and to attack them before the British can get their act together and attack Spanish Louisiana. So it was to move fast and hit them before they can organize their resistance. Target one is Baton Rouge. That's not how they said it, right? They said it with a French or Spanish accent, not with a American Western New York accent, but that's the best I can do. So Baton Rouge is their target. Baton Rouge today, the city straddles the Mississippi River, but in that period is on the eastern side of the Mississippi River, which means that it was part of British West Florida, because West Florida goes to the river itself. So that's that. So Galvez is here in New Orleans, and he got his guys together. He's going to march them, right, not up I-10, but he's going to march them over through the swamps and everything up to Baton Rouge. He decides to set out in September. Of course, I don't think there's a good month for marching through the swamps of the Louisiana backcountry, but I'm guessing that September is probably one of the worst months to get going because a hurricane comes in and strikes that area. The swamps are swollen and everything, and it's just a big mess. It kind of forces them to march overland up to Baton Rouge. Here is a really wonderful painting that I really like. This painting showing kind of the artist's imagination of what the march would have looked like. It's by a contemporary Spanish artist. It's really striking. I like this painting a lot. So you can see how they're kind of struggling to wade through the swamp. You get some idea of the diversity of the people. Right, there's natives here. I think this guy is of African descent back here. Okay, so regular army, probably militiaman. It's not in a regular army uniform. I love this guy here at the drum, right, struggling. He's probably thinking, can't you guys just march on your own for a change? Why do you need me to beat the drum to keep the beat, to keep you in line? Just march for yourself, okay? This is hard enough without having to play the stupid drum. Also, this guy here, I like his kind of annoyed look like, come on, guys, you can't march through the swamp here. We do it all the time. Okay, so I really like that painting a lot. So that's how they get up there to the vicinity of Baton Rouge. Before they get to Baton Rouge, there's kind of an outpost here on the way called Fort Butte. Butte was a British prime minister in the 1760s, I believe. That's who Butte was. And this is a French and Indian War era fort that has kind of grown, it's been dilapidated, left in a state of disrepair. And that is easily overcome by Galvez and his men. And so they take that one first, and then they lay siege to Baton Rouge itself. Okay. Now let me just take a slight aside here just to talk a little bit about what a siege was, what the strategy was, what the game is really in a siege. So with a siege, you have a fortified position, a fort, and the defenders are inside. And then the attackers, they lay siege, meaning that they dig these trenches closer and closer to the fort. And they dig down deep enough and throw the dirt up high enough that they're protected from being shot at from the fort itself. So they can kind of dig, not unmolested, but relative safety. And then you kind of dig closer and closer to the fort. And once you get close enough within range of your heavy guns, your kind of mortars, then you can start firing those into the fort, kind of up out of your trench and up kind of a high arc over into the fort itself. And then once that starts, it's only a matter of time before the fort has to give up, before it's kind of pummeled into nothing. And usually any commander of this era, British, French, Spanish, whoever, once they see that happening, they'll usually surrender rather than prolong the inevitable and get a bunch of guys killed. Okay, so that's the thing. Now, the defenders, what they're trying to do is to hold out long enough that they can get somebody out to send word to the next fort over to send reinforcements. Okay, so that's the goal. And that's really the game. Can the attackers dig fast enough to get their heavy guns in place before reinforcements can arrive to lift the siege? Okay, so that's the game here, right? Who can you dig faster than the other guy can get help? Okay, so that's how it works. Okay. During the siege of Baton Rouge, one of the things Galvez does is he starts digging, and then he lays a diversion. So he has his men attack from a different side along a tree line, kind of a feint, and that distracts the defenders so that his guys are able to dig. Right, they can dig faster because they don't have to be worried about being shot at quite as much, and they get them closer, faster. Then they are able to open up their big guns, and then the British surrender. Okay, so they've taken Baton Rouge in 1779. So that's stage one. And there's Galvez again. Okay. Target two is several months later, and that's Mobile. So Mobile is here in today's Alabama. And Mobile, if some of you have been there, you'll know this is a very wide bay. So I used to live, when I lived in that area, I lived over here in this area, and I'd take the highway over across the bay over to the city of Mobile where the college was. And it's, I think it's like 8 or 9 miles. It's far up here. And it's much further down here. Okay. Yeah, so it's big. I mean, it's big across there. So you can see here, so this is a nice big bay here, so you can easily get ships in and out. So that's why it's a great place to have a port. And then it's well defended here. There's a narrow inlet in here to get your ships in. So Galvez organizes a kind of two-pronged attack here. So he organizes his men in New Orleans and sails them around here. And then they meet up with reinforcements who come from Cuba, right? Cuba, if you can imagine, is down here. So they meet up here outside the entrance to the bay. They try to get their way in. There's some ships that get caught on the shoals here, the narrow entrance, and some sink or get stuck. But eventually, they're able to push their way in through the inlet here and into the bay. Then they sail up to here where they land. Okay, this yellow pin here is the Spanish landing point. And they march towards the British fort. So Fort Charlotte is the name of the British fort over here. And then they dig. And they dig towards the fort. Okay, same strategy, right? Can they dig fast enough to get their heavy guns in place before British reinforcements arrive? Because that's the siege of Fort Charlotte. Now, the British hear about this, right? So they hear about it in Pensacola. Pensacola is over over here. And it's not that far away. So the British reinforcements are on the way, and they get up to here. Okay. When one morning, right, that's close, right? They're ready to, they can take some boats down here and get there very fast. They get up in the morning to get started, and they hear cannon fire, right? The fire of the Spanish guns. And they know they got there too late. Okay. So the siege is already, the final stage of the siege is already underway. They got there too late. Okay. They probably shouldn't have stopped off for a snack there at one of the rest stops on the border there. No, they just got there too late. I mean, that's the game, right? The Spanish were able to dig fast enough. They got the siege, the last stage before the British reinforcements arrive. Okay. Now I'd like to talk about the siege of Pensacola itself, and the main event here. So this is the geography of Pensacola. See, I'm sure some people have been there. You can imagine what it's like there. So Pensacola itself is up here, the city. It's up here. I think it has a very nice deep water bay here that you can get ships in. And it is very well defended through its barrier islands here. So if you're going to sail in here, you get to sail up this way, and then make another turn this way, and then up this way. Okay. And as you can imagine, if you're defending this inlet here, there are lots of great places where you can defend it from. The British established 2 batteries. Okay. One here on what was called Red Cliffs. This is a slightly higher elevation, okay, looking down. And then the other was on Santa Rosa Island. Okay. This is called Fort Pickens. This is a Civil War era fort. Well, it was there before the Civil War. Then I think the Union actually captures this, I believe. They at least they attacked that area there. So this is Fort Pickens was not there. That was a Civil War era kind of thing. It was at the end of the barrier island here. So the British have emplacements here and here, and anything that comes through, they can shoot at them. Okay. So that's there. The city itself is also very well defended. So once you get up here, there's a fort. There's a fort in here. There's a city itself, then there's a fort defending it. And then there are 2 what are called redoubts. A redoubt is kind of like a smaller fortified position that is above the fort. So they have some cannon placements up here. Pensacola, again, if you've never been there, or if you have been there, you can kind of remember, there's actually a little bit of elevation there in Pensacola. Oddly for Florida, which is the flattest state in the country, there are a little bit some hills here in this area. Okay, so yeah, that does go a little bit of elevation up here. Is a little bit higher elevation than down here by the waterfront. And so they have these batteries up here, the so-called redoubts, the King's Redoubt, the Queen's Redoubt and the Prince of Wales Redoubt, that would kind of have reinforcing fire that could protect the fort from an enemy approaching from up this way. And so that's how Pensacola itself is defended. So yeah, so this is very well defended. As you can imagine, it's the capital of the colony. Okay, so that's where the governor is, the military center there. So that's the best defended of the various emplacements that Galvez is attacking. Okay, so this is the climactic one, the hardest one to crack. Galvez, here's another statue of Galvez in Pensacola. You can see there. He enters Pensacola Bay. So he has his ships meet up from Cuba, sail up to Cuba. They're out here outside of the inlet here. And the first ship that goes in, the naval commander, he gets stuck and he's like, okay, this is not going to work. We can't do this. Okay, I'm not taking all of my ships through here. We're all going to get stuck and destroyed. Okay, you got to find a different way or give up or whatever. We're not going to do it. That's what the naval commander says. So the Navy wants to turn back. Galvez, however, is not going to stand for that. There's some kind of what's it called? The different branches of the armed forces here in Spain. The Navy has its chain of command, and Galvez, he leads the army, okay, but not the naval commander. So they don't report to Galvez. So he's got to kind of assert his authority. He does have control over one of the ships that he brought from Louisiana. So that's under his authority. And he says to the men on the ship, he says, whoever has honor and courage, follow me. So he's going to take his ship through there first to prove it can be done. And that's just what he does. So he forces his ship to go through this area. And it turns out that it's not as hard as it appeared. The British gun emplacements here are just not very accurate in firing on ships coming in through the bay. Okay, I mean, it looks like you're shooting fish in a barrel there, but they just weren't very accurate in their ability to fire on a moving ship, right? That's hard, right? But they're just not able to do it. So it's not as dangerous as it might appear to be. So Galvez was able to get his ship through. Galvez then, later after he comes back, he gives a speech to his men to inspire them. And he says, I, my sons, went alone to sacrifice myself so as not to expose a single soldier. I don't think anybody pointed this out at the time, but we can point out this, that Bernardo, what is this? I myself went alone. You didn't row the ship yourself, okay? You know, one of these other guys who sailed the ship with you under your orders. And he conveniently forgot that part. This saying, these words that Galvez speaks, they later get polished a little bit further, and they become his motto: "Yo solo, I alone." See on the statue there, and he had the permission of the King of Spain, gave him permission to put "Yo solo" on his coat of arms. So that then becomes Galvez's his kind of his personal statement there, his brand, if you will, if you like that way of thinking. "Yo solo, I alone." Again, he didn't go alone. He went with other men. And I think this is really important. This points out the importance of having a good editor, right? Because he never said "yo solo, I alone." He said a slightly more verbose version. But then they got polished really nicely to a simple two-word motto: "I alone." So that was really, really effective there. Okay? So yeah, you see how some of these famous sayings of the American Revolution, right? I mean, it's not that he never said it. He didn't technically say those exact words, but it was certainly his meaning. Okay, but it gets a little bit changed as time goes on and kind of polishes things up a little bit. Not what he said exactly in the heat of the moment. So that's Galvez and Yo Solo. Once the Spanish ships get into the bay, they regroup here. Okay, they regroup over here. And then they sail up together to land here outside of Pensacola itself. And then they dig. Right? They dig towards Pensacola. They are like the seven dwarves, like to dig, right? That's what they do. So they dig their way towards Pensacola itself. The British, their one hope is that they can have Native Americans or Native American allies can help protect them. And that might help lift the siege. There are several attacks by Native Americans on the Spanish as they are digging towards Pensacola, but the Spanish are able to fend them off. And then the native allies of Britain, they make a decision, they make a calculation. They can kind of see how things are going, and they don't want to be going down with the British. They don't want to be backing the wrong side in the outcome of the war. So they remove their support for Britain. They don't go over to the Spanish side. They just leave the battlefield to leave the British to fend for themselves against the Spanish. Okay, so the Native American allies desert the British, right, not wanting to be on the losing side, which then ensures that Britain will be the losing side. So as the siege is then underway, they're digging towards Pensacola, they're firing on Pensacola, the Spanish are. There is one morning a lucky shot, right? One of the cannons, it gets into the powder magazine that is in the Queen's Redoubt. And once one of the cannon ball gets into the powder magazine, you'd think they'd close the door while they're under siege. I don't know exactly what happened, but a shock is in there. Then there's a huge explosion. It ignites all the powder that's stored in the powder magazine. So there's an enormous explosion, and this is a print from the 18th century depicting that explosion at the Queen's Redoubt. The story is that it's one of these stories that may or may not be true, but it sounds pretty good. So I'll tell the story anyway. is that, again, Galvez, so the shelling is underway, and Galvez is getting ready in the morning, for his day. He's in his tent there, kind of doing his thing in the morning. There's always kind of, you ever think about that, right? You have your morning routine, right? Everybody in the 18th century had their morning routine too, to get themselves ready and all that kind of thing, and get dressed and do their bathroom stuff and all that kind of thing. It's the same way in the 18th century. So Galvez is doing all that when he hears an enormous explosion. And then he knows what that is, right? There's been a huge explosion, right? Something big has happened, sees what it is, and then gets everybody ready to go attack right in that moment, right? It's like, there's a huge explosion. The British are vulnerable. Let's go now, right? Forget this digging tourism stuff. Get out of the trench and attack right now. Because the British are there's been something big has happened. They can just go now and overwhelm them. And that is what the Spanish do. So the British, after that, following that lucky shot, that big explosion, then the British can see that they're done for, that's it, and they surrender. Again, in the 18th century, you typically surrender rather than fighting to the last man, because all that does is get a bunch of guys killed. And 18th century gentlemen on all sides, they have an ideal of fighting a war like a gentleman and trying to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. At least it's an ideal, often not carried out, but that's the ideal at least. Okay, so the British surrender. Some concluding remarks here. The overall importance of the Spanish victory at Pensacola and their larger victory in the Gulf Coast campaign. One historian of this episode put it an extremely good phrase that I'll take here. I think it really expresses very well the importance of the moment. And she said that by losing Pensacola, Britain had lost a colony that hadn't rebelled. So you have these 13 colonies in formal rebellion. You have some loyal ones, but now you've lost one of the loyal ones. Right? That's not good, right? I mean, maybe if you lost some of the ones who were rebelling, you kind of understand that, right? But one of the ones that was loyal, now the British are further behind than when they started the war so many years earlier. Right? So much money spent, so many lives lost, and now they're losing ground very clearly. They've lost a colony that hadn't even rebelled. It's also important to put the Pensacola victory in the context of the year of 1781. So in May of 1781 is when Pensacola surrenders. And then later that fall, in October of 1781, is when Yorktown, the American and French victory at Yorktown, where the British surrender, also happens. So you've had a surrender of British forces, 2 of them in the same year. Now, maybe one of those you could write off to bad luck. Of course, in a war, you're going to have defeats. Okay, it happens. But 2 of them the same year. Right? And the second one, Yorktown, honestly, is probably more important because it's a larger army that surrenders, and it's closer to the heart of the action. It's in the largest of the North American colonies. So Yorktown is more important than Pensacola was. But I think it's important as we think about this to remember it was the second one that year. I think the only other British surrender during the war was at Saratoga earlier in the war. So yeah, this doesn't happen very often. Now it's happened twice in the same year. Initially, King George III, when he learns about Yorktown, his intention is to fight on. So he really wanted to keep fighting, but it's fairly clear to others, and eventually King George comes around to this, the reality is that there's not going to be winning this war. They need to seek negotiated peace on terms that give the United States its independence. The final import of the victory is that Spain is then able to regain the Floridas. So East and West Florida then pass back to Spain as a result of Spain's activity led by Galvez attacking the British positions in West Florida. Okay, so the Floridas go back to Spain. So you have the European control. We have Spanish Florida, then there's the British period, then there's the Spanish period, and then finally in the 1820s, the United States acquires Florida. That brings me to the conclusion to my talk today. I have my contact information there if you'd like to stay in touch. We have plenty of time for discussion here today after the talk, and I look forward to hearing your comments. But if there's something that comes to you later today, or maybe you're drifting off to sleep tonight and you bolt up in bed and think, I know, I wanted to ask that about Galvez. Okay. Well, you don't have to stay up all night tossing and turning, concerned that you'll never get an answer to your question. You have my contact information there that I'd be delighted to hear from you in the future. This is a copy of my book here with the handsome cover. For a long time, my second daughter, my middle child, I had her convinced that this was a picture of Daddy on the cover of the book. But recently she's learned that no, that's George Washington instead. Okay. Which is disappointing because I was perfectly happy to have her believe I was George Washington. I should mention the book is not about the Battle of Pensacola that I talked about. It's about the last 2 years of the American Revolution, principally in the northeastern part of the United States, but it's George Washington and the American Revolution more generally. I want to thank you again for listening today, and I look forward to continuing our discussion and trying to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thanks so much, David. That was fascinating. I don't know about anybody else, but I just learned a whole lot. I feel silly that I didn't know, but that's what historians do.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
I did not know about West Florida.
Yes, well, next time if you're traveling on I-10, you can impress everybody you're traveling with this was once West Florida.
What got you interested in? I think George Washington is your area of expertise, correct?
Yes.
What happened?
Yes. So growing up, I mean, so that was something we were interested in. I wish I brought it with me. My sister visited over one of my sisters visited over the Memorial Day holiday. She brought some pictures from when we were kids with us, and she brought me one that was taken at Mount Vernon, George Washington's home in 1984, summer of 1984, I think, maybe 1985. I forget which year exactly, and had me and my brothers and sisters who were around at that time with one of the trees that was there from George Washington's day. So it's something that goes way back. I asked one of my friends who works at Mount Vernon if that tree is still there. It looks like no, it's not still there. There have been some damage, some storms or something not too long ago. Which is, that would have been cool to take my own children back to the same tree and take a picture of the same place. So yes, my interest goes way back in time to that, to kind of my earliest days growing up and getting exposed to history going way back there. And it really is wonderful that I get to do that so often. Something that was important growing up is still part of my life. It's wonderful.
Awesome. Bonnie, you had your hand raised for a minute. Any actions in East Florida? So
yes, there are some raids that come from Georgia over the border into East Florida. St. Augustine area over the border from Georgia, but nothing as significant or as organized, as systematic as that Spanish campaign, right? Galvez is determined to take each of those posts one by one and then take Pensacola itself. So yes, there are some skirmishing and that kind of battle over the border, from principally launched from Georgia down, but just a different scale of organization than the fighting in Pensacola in West Florida itself. Oh, you're muted, Deb.
Just realized that. Does anybody have any questions before we go? All right. Thank you very much for joining David Head today and being part of our Florida history series. So many of us are not native Floridians, and we don't know a lot about our state. So this is a fantastic thing that you are doing, David, and being part of the Florida Humanities Council that supplies us with the directories that we need to find you. And also I'd like to thank the Friends of the Library, the Leesburg Friends of the Library, who support and pay for all of our paid programs here. A wonderful group of volunteers. And we are just absolutely lucky to have them support us in this way. So with that, everybody, have a great rest of your day. Thank you again, David. Really, really appreciate this talk today.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for having me.